Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today's Wednesday, March 20th, and it's also a pleasure to be joined here in the studio by Donald Keelan, who is no stranger to the studio, I might add, having hosted a show or two of his own in the past, and we still are able to drag him in here every now and then to do an interview with somebody famous and notable. So Don, welcome back to GNAT.
Thank you for having me here this morning.
Don is a resident of Arlington and a retired CPA and a real estate developer. He's also a writer and author, which is kind of what prompted his appearance here today, because Don has just published a new book, Observations on Nonprofits, an informal guide for board members and volunteers, a collection of the many columns and op-ed pieces he's published over the years in local newspapers. So it's great to have you here today, Don, to talk a little bit about the book and some of the pieces that you have in there. I guess just to get us started, what interested you in the whole question of governance and of nonprofit boards and organizations? I mean, you served on several, so I imagine that experience probably drove part of it, but you've clearly delved into this whole subject quite a bit.
Well, part of it has to do with the fact that over the last almost 40 years now, I've been involved with nonprofits in one capacity or another. When I was with Arthur Anderson in New York City, we used to do the audits of nonprofits. When I came up here, and even when I lived in New York, we were an advisor to nonprofits, served on advisory boards, volunteered, was a contributor, came up here, basically did the same except audits, and then served as a trustee, and then came to the realization that Vermont has more nonprofits per capita than any place in the country.
Really?
Yeah.
How is that?
Well, because there's so many, the needs are so vast in the social area, the recreation area, the governance area, the arts, history, that the nonprofit world has picked up the slack that would normally be done either commercially or by government. So you have about, the number keeps fluctuating, about 5,000. At least a little bit more than that, registered with the Secretary of State.
So this is nonprofit organizations and their boards. Wow. So I guess was there any sense that this was a good time to kind of pull all that work that you've put together over the past 15 or so years and publish the book now? I mean, is it just sort of just happened to kind of come together at this point, or was there something going on out there that made you think, it's time to kind of gather these all together and publish them in one book?
Well, a few years ago, the Attorney General's office was in touch with me because they had realized I had written a number of columns on nonprofits, and at the same time, that office, which governs nonprofits in Vermont, by the way, they were interested in coming out with a publication on being a board member in Vermont and what your duties and responsibilities were as a board member. And they asked me to be their advisor. So they did come out with their publication. I did help them with it, and it's a 19-page publication on being a board member, or what your duties and responsibilities are. And if anyone's serving on a board, they should make an effort to read that, and you can get it on the Attorney General's website. So I said, there's a lot more to it than what's in that pamphlet or that publication. So I decided, well, over the years I've written 75 columns, or if not more, on nonprofits. For the Manchester Journal and Bennington Banner and Vermont Digger. So I said, let me put them all together, and I've been asked by others to do that. Why don't you just compile your columns? So I did that, and I actually, the book is a section in governance, being a board member, your duties and responsibilities, financial matters, and internal controls, and some general topics, and some profiles on some people who have been in the nonprofit world here in Vermont.
Is it your experience that most people get recruited onto boards? Do they get any kind of formal training or or any kind of sort of period when they, if it's the first time they're on a board, for instance, and they have no experience with that role in the past, do they get any kind of support or training to say, well, here's kind of what we're expecting you to do? Does that tend to happen, or is it kind of more catch as catch can?
Well, I obviously can't speak for all the nonprofits in Vermont, but the ones that I've witnessed, and the answer to your question, which is a great question, the answer I believe is no. Yes, they may get a book on the bylaws of the organization, the financial statements, the recent tax return, and maybe some minutes, but very little, if any, formal training by the board. And the other thing that's not done, and I've encouraged this for years, is to have a board mentor. So if you join the board, let's say of Hildene, just to pick an organization that's local, that for 6 months, your first 6 months on that board, you're given another board member who's going to monitor, who's going to be your mentor, and so that if you go to meetings and you're a little bit embarrassed about raising a question at the meeting because of your ignorance and so forth, you may hold the question and ask your mentor, and then your mentor, should help you through a lot of the history and other issues, and we don't have that. Interesting enough, in New York State, I believe it's still in effect, if you join a school board in New York, you have to go to continuing education. It's mandatory. I don't believe we have that here in Vermont. And you must ask yourself why, because a school board is a very complex board to be on, not just because the educational issues that are involved and what we're going through with Act 46 and Act 77 and all that. The other one is the finances are extremely complex, and they're in my opinion, they're second to a hospital. To be a hospital board is the most complex board to serve on.
And why is that?
Well, the financial statements and the financial matters that board members must deal with at a hospital are so complex, and the amount of reporting that you're given as a board member, the amount of packages that you're given, it can be overwhelming. I mean, I served on the board of a hospital, and I had to have a separate file cabinet in my office just for the hospital material. And I'm sure there are people out there listening and watching this that serve on hospital boards, and I believe they'll confirm that. And yet, where are you trained to understand the nuances of a hospital board and the matters that you come? They're so complex, Andrew, that they have a lexicon to give you the interpretation of all the acronyms that are used. And the other part of it is, it's constantly changing, as you know, with the Affordable Care Act and other things that are coming down the pike. Right. It's very complex.
Right, and very tricky to navigate, as we're seeing over in the Springfield Hospital, for instance, is a good example, I think, of a hospital that is right now really struggling to kind of stay afloat financially, because they ran into some financial issues there. I guess I'm just wondering, I think you addressed this in the book, but what do you see as the biggest challenges that nonprofit boards face? Is it financial? It sounds like that's kind of really the core of what their main role is supposed to be, is to ensure that an organization is financially viable and sustaining itself. Is that the main thing that a board member needs to worry about, and is everything else kind of secondary to that, or is everything equally kind of critical?
Well, I guess the mission of the organization is what they should really be first in their minds. But in order to carry out the mission, what do you need? And obviously you need cash flow, meaning you need to have a viable financial program going on to provide the cash flow. You need to have fellow board members, and that has become a critical issue here now in Vermont. People serving on boards, because we have an aging population. We have a younger population that is having a difficult time finding the time to serve on boards. And And the third one is, do we have too many have too much duplication among our nonprofit organizations? And is there not enough working together and finding out, do we need to have, I think there was one time there, I believe it was in Bennington, there were 8 organizations serving food to the people that were challenged in that area. I mean, do you need 8? I mean, couldn't they not work together? I believe that may have been cut back. But certainly, a trustee's, one of the foremost responsibilities of a trustee is finances, to make sure that it's a fiduciary responsibility. And unfortunately, many board members aren't aware of that.
And do you, probably a lot of the people who get recruited onto boards don't have that kind of in-depth financial background like that an accountant, let's say, might have. I'm thinking back to a couple of boards I've been on, and there was always like one or two people who were kind of the money guys or whatever, because they were accountants or financial experts in one way or another, and we all kind of tended to defer to them because we figured they were understanding the budget better than the rest of us. I imagine that's probably not too dissimilar from many other places.
That's very true. And in my own case, my wife served on the board of the Bennington Museum, if I can name a board. And the night before a board meeting, she would ask me to give her review the financial statements of the museum with her, and to give her key points that she should be aware of. And not every board member has a CPA at home to help them with that. But boards, they must have on their board someone who has a financial background that can assist the other board members. What you don't want is to have a board full of CPAs or lawyers, right? Because that's not where it's at.
I want a range of views, or
exactly, and hopefully you can rely on those board members who've got that background. The problem is, I don't know whether they're not speaking up, they're not at meetings, or they've been disengaged, because we've seen too many failures here in Vermont, so something went awry.
Well, one of the issues that public boards, like school boards or select boards, town boards of one sort or another, tend to deal with or are forced to deal with from time to time, is this whole question of transparency or executive session. From time to time they might discuss something, off camera or behind closed doors, whatever. And then sometimes they'll get requests for Freedom of Information Act request, which they might have to comply with. I guess on a nonprofit board, do we have the equivalent thing where there are times when going into executive session, not recording the minutes and that kind of, is that ever appropriate? Are there situations where that happens?
I'm sure it does.
It should happen. I mean,
again, I can't speak for all nonprofits, but I think when they, I'm not sure it's so much executive session, although they can do that. They, unlike a municipal board, a school board or a town board, a nonprofit board can restrict who comes to their meetings. I mean, they are to some degree private. I'm not 100% in agreement with that. I think a nonprofit organization is in fact a quasi-public organization in that it's supported by taxes, and the trustees are there to represent the community because it's a nonprofit organization being subsidized in a way by the by our tax laws. But there are some issues that probably should not be discussed publicly, and that is obviously contract negotiations, where you can have a little bit more freedom in executive session. And there's another area, and that is employment issues.
Okay.
And here again, I have mixed feelings on that, because I think when either a nonprofit or a state a municipal agency, when they terminate someone and give a large severance, I think the public should know what's going on there and not have it not known to the public because of a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement. Well, that's fine the corporate world can do that because they are private, right? But I don't believe that's appropriate in the nonprofit world. Once a decision has been made, the public should know without having the press file the FOIA.
The FOIA request. Well, we have a couple of situations, as it turns out, occurring right now involving two area private colleges that highlight the role of boards, and I think to some degree, and the stories are still unfolding and everything, but I'm referring obviously to Southern Vermont College in Bennington and Green Mountain College in Pulteney, where both schools announced recently that they'd be shutting down at the end of the current spring semester. Both boards clearly were thrown into a crisis situation. But I guess I'm just wondering, the main job of a board is supposed to be, I guess, oversight, right? I mean, to what degree should they be monitoring these sorts of situations where, there's the business model, if you will, of the schools must have been, I guess, eroding in some way or another, or not going along according to what they were hoping was going to be happening. How active should a board get before we get to a crisis situation? And then second part of the question would be, what happens when you are in the crisis and there's still hope of salvaging things? How does the board's role change in that case?
Wow, that's quite a bit to that question. The boards, it should not be a surprise to the board in the ideal world that we could have a crisis. I mean, they should be kept informed, and they should make sure they are informed. All too often, executive directors of organizations may not provide the board with the knowledge that he or she has, and therefore the board is not reacting to it. The colleges you mentioned, they seemed like that was a precipitous closing. Relatively, we heard on one week they were in trouble, and then a few weeks later they're closing.
Yeah, it seemed like
is that not right? And that happened down in North Adams Medical Center a few years ago.
Right.
It was in 3 days that they closed. The board said we're closing. Well, nobody really knew about that.
Yeah.
And in addition to the two colleges you mentioned, we lost another college 2 years ago, and that was Burlington College, the last president of that college, Carol Moore, wrote quite a piece in the Journal of Higher Education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and she really put a lot of the responsibility of that closing on the board for failing to do their carrying out their fiduciary role. And I'm not saying that's the case at Green Mountain or at Southern Vermont, but at Southern Vermont, from what I have been reading in the press, several things happened several years ago that the board should have digested and said, look, are we really in trouble now? And what should we be doing now to prevent us from having to close in 2019? And that is, you recall that college had a major capital expansion, took on a huge debt of $6.5 million. I believe it was for the dorms. Some of it was contributed, but not. They still went into debt for $6.5 million. They had a major embezzlement that really not only cost them financially, although some of it was reimbursed by the insurance, but a lot of it was not. It also had tremendous public relations impact on them, and they lost probably students from that. But they also had an accreditation problem going on with their nursing program at the time. So any business can deal with 1 or 2 issues, but when you start to deal with 3 or 4 issues that are really serious, it becomes really a crisis. And back 4 years ago, was the board aware of the fact and doing something about the fact that they were losing students? Why Carol Moore, I believe, addressed the problem in Burlington, when that college was moving from the storefront Catholic diocese property they were acquiring on Lake Champlain, the projections given to the board, we were going to go from 150 students to 600. At the same time, throughout Vermont, the small colleges were losing students, and the demographics, the trend was, we're going to lose a lot more.
Right. Somebody should have questioned that projection, I guess. I'm sure
what bothers me is, when should a board know we're in trouble? And if they're really active and asking the right questions and challenging, not argumentative, not in an argumentative way, but challenging the administration on the facts, because that's what they're there for. They're not there to rubber stamp the administration. They're there to provide the support and at the same time, challenge what's being asked. We had it here locally. The board was quite surprised. The board, this is now the board of Manchester and the Mountains Chamber of Commerce, I guess that's what you call it. A few years ago, closed here, and the board was shocked that that they were in trouble. Well, how can you be shocked if you've been kept informed and you looked at the financial statements and saw that you didn't have any cash? At the same time, the organization was going out looking for partnerships with towns, thinking that you were going to be sustained. But internally, your financial statements, if they were available to the board, would have shown, and they actually did show, that the organization was in deep financial trouble. But it should, in other words, I'm saying, it should not be a surprise.
To that point, yeah.
It shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah,
And that's what I try to address in the book to some degree, that the trustees have a job to do, and the job is a major job is stay on top of the finances.
Right. And
there's a way in which to do that.
Okay. In your book, many of the columns date back to 2004, 2005, 2006. I guess I just found myself wondering, has much changed in the past 12, 15 or so years since you wrote those? Do you feel like that basic situation that may have inspired a column back in 2004, we're still kind of in that same situation?
I think, unfortunately, I think we are. Because when I was doing the editing of all those old columns, if you will, that had been published in the papers, I find that some of the situations are still the same today, particularly in the area of the lack of financial controls in nonprofits. There's been more of an increase in embezzlements, and fairly sizable ones. And that's the same now as it was back then. Nonprofits do not have the money to pay for an outside audit. Nonprofits have a very special way of providing too much trust to the people that are involved in the finances. And as CPAs will tell you, trust is not an internal control. Trust is feeling, and you have to have internal controls. And many nonprofits fail to either have established internal controls or follow what they do have. And just so everyone knows, internal controls to a nonprofit or to a business is to what infection control is to a hospital. If a hospital fails to follow their infection control policy, they're in for a crisis. And similarly in business, nonprofits and so forth, they fail to follow their internal controls. They're going to be in a financial crisis.
Do you think this the whole demographic issue that you alluded to earlier in our conversation? I mean, my guess is, and I've heard this from folks who've been trying to recruit people onto boards. It's really hard to find people who are ready, willing, and able, and have the time. Like you say, everyone seems to be pretty busy, particularly those folks in the 30 to 50-year-old bracket. They're busy raising families and building careers and whatnot. The kind of people you'd want to have who have some background and some financial savvy and expertise are kind of hard, few and far between. And we keep on hearing here in Vermont that there's this demographic issue where we're an aging state. I mean, where do you see that panning out? I mean, if if more people aren't available to kind of step forward to fill these spots in these nonprofits.
I definitely see a consolidation emerging because they can't sustain themselves if they're not going to have the trustees. I mean, you experienced a little bit of that in Sunderland recently, where they almost didn't have enough people going out running for the select board.
Right.
And if you don't have, in Vermont, a nonprofit must have at least 3 trustees, otherwise they can't exist. They have to have a quorum. If they don't, and you can't have a meeting without obviously having a quorum, and if you do, you're violating your bylaws. If you're violating your bylaws, you're really you're not a nonprofit. You're a club. And, the other thing is part of the problem is so many people who work here don't live here, and we're seeing in Arlington we did a study and we saw that Arlington has about 1,100 employees working in the community on a daily basis. Many of them, if not more than half of them, don't live in Arlington anymore. And you know, you can just carry, I mean, I'm sure that's the same way in Manchester because of affordability of housing, the lack of housing. So they're volunteering, if they are volunteering, in the communities in which they live in and not here. And then obviously I mentioned the aging. And we're not getting the second homeowners that would come up for the summer, and many of them served on boards here and helped out, but they're not coming here as much as they used to.
I mean, is it possible for someone to kind of live elsewhere and kind of serve on a board and kind of, you know, phone in or, you know, attend remotely these meetings? Does that work, or do you really need to have somebody who's kind of in the area and able to show up in person at those meetings?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and that applies to well, one board I know specifically, and that is Southern Vermont College. When you look at their list of trustees, their board members, I believe there are maybe 15. I believe only 3 are from the area. I could be wrong there, but most of them are scattered throughout the United States, and that raises another question: were they available to the president of the college and the administration of the college and helping them with their crisis?
Right.
Because they're scattered all over the place. Yeah, you can be in touch obviously electronically today and so forth, but you know, feet on the ground.
At some point, yeah.
And we have a few others here locally that have gone outside the area to bring in trustees. And that's not to say that they're not contributing, and I don't really know. But the thing is, I know when I did serve on boards, it was great, particularly when I served on the Hill Dean board, maybe 1 trustee was not from the area. Everyone else was from the area. We had meetings at 11 o'clock up at the Congregational Church in Manchester, allowed us to use their hall, and everyone was there. This is during the day. I mean, try to call a meeting of trustees today at 11 o'clock in the morning. And it's very difficult.
Yeah,
it's very difficult.
Probably impossible. Well, the book is called Observations on Nonprofits, an informal guide for board members and volunteers. And where is it available, Don? The North Shire Bookstore, I think?
North Shire Bookstore is the sole place, and the website is dbkeelan.com.
All right.
And it'll take you right to the North Shire. But they are, and they've been very helpful to me on my other books, so I want to make sure they had this one.
All right. Well, you can go back and read a whole bunch of columns that appeared in the paper, and a really interesting introduction as well. So, well, Don, thank you so much for carving the time out of your day here to come and be with us and tell us a little bit about it. And, you know, those of you who might be inclined to serve on a board, you know, might want to think about stepping up there and, what's the term? Giving something back to the community or whatever.
Absolutely.
It's service is its own reward. Great. Well, thanks again for being with us today. Hope you found the show interesting and informative, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.